ICT International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
Hello and welcome to IDC International Radio 106.2 FM. You're here with me, Sabrina Zeloof, and I'm covering the 17th Annual World Summit on Counter-Terrorism. With me in the studio, I have the real honor to be interviewing Michael Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President of RAND Corporation and member of the Professional Advisory Board at the ICT. So a real friend of the IDC. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field, how you joined RAND.
I'm a former soldier, and I came directly from the military service to the RAND Corporation.
What did you do in the military?
I was in Army Special Forces and served in Latin America, and then I had a total of 4 tours in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during the war.
Wow.
I came to RAND as a junior researcher to work on national security issues. And in 1972, as a new member of the staff, wrote a memo suggesting that the problem of terrorism was likely to increase, become increasingly international, and could affect us, the United States, and our allies in a number of ways. And therefore it was something we ought to pay more attention to, and I outlined what some of the policy issues that might arise from this new threat. This memo went off to Washington. Didn't hear much immediately until 2 spectacular, tragic terrorist incidents took place. One in May of 1972 here in Israel, in which 3 terrorists, members of the Japanese Red Army, got off a plane at what was then called Lod Airport, now Ben Gurion Airport, and began machine gunning arriving passengers from the United States, most of whom turned out to be Puerto Rican pilgrims. And it wasn't simply the scale of the carnage. 30 people were killed, 80 or so were wounded. It was the question, the Japanese were allied with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So the question was, how is it that Japanese come to Israel to kill Puerto Ricans on behalf of Palestinians?
Yeah.
And that caught people's attention, and that was followed, of course, in September by the Munich incident, in which members of the Israeli athletic team were held hostage and died in that episode. And those episodes acted as a catalyst for a number of governments, including the United States, to in a sense, get their act together. It led in the United States to the creation of something called the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism. And it was shortly after the creation of that committee that somebody, I think, stumbled across this memo I had written and said, gee, there's some fellow out at the RAND Corporation. Why don't we ask RAND to do research for us?
Incredible.
And that's the origins of the research program.
Wow, crazy story. Unlucky that we had to go through the motions of terrorism for that memo to come to light, but it's good to know that experts get to the right places and that your opinions are heard. You were telling me before the interview a bit about this report on the origins of American jihadists.
Well, this is a source of current debate in the United States. We are concerned about the terrorist threat for obvious reasons. We're still engaged in military operations in Afghanistan, in Syria, and in other countries. And we have gone through a number of terrorist incidents ourselves in recent years, including the massacre that led to 49 people being killed at a nightclub. No, 49 killed at a nightclub in Florida,
Miami, yes.
and then 14 were killed prior to that in California, in San Bernardino. So the debate is, who are they? How are they coming to the United States? Or are they already in the United States? And if so, how do they become jihadists? Now, the answer to that question has critical policy consequences, because if they're coming primarily from abroad, then you try to deal with the problem by controlling the number of immigrants, the number of refugees, by so-called extreme vetting. You try, in a sense, to wall off the country from an external threat. If instead they are radicalizing in the United States, then you're looking at measures to identify how they radicalize, who is radicalizing, and
That's
how
much
we can
harder.
intervene. Which is, well, it is. Neither one of them is easy to do. And so what we did is simply took all of those who had been involved in jihadist-inspired or jihadist-directed plots or attacks in the United States since 9/11, so 16 years.
All right.
That gave me 178 names of individuals. Some of them were killed during the attack. Others are currently in prison or have served time in prison. And we wanted to look at, all right, where did they come from? Well, it turns out that 48% of them were born in the United States.
Wow.
And 91 of them came from abroad. So then we took a closer look at those who came from abroad. And we said, okay, what countries are they coming from? Can we do something with that? It turns out that nationality is a poor predictor of the activity. They came from a total of 39 different countries.
Wow. That really shows. I mean, I'm assuming the majority, these are Islamic terrorists, jihadists.
All of the entire universe here. I focused on
your university
those who
campus.
were inspired by Al-Qaeda or ISIS ideology. So they're
I
all
mean, it really
jihadists.
shows the scope of this jihadist ideology.
It does. But then we said, okay, of these 91, nationality is a poor indicator. Is there some way we can identify these individuals? Of course, people in the current administration have spoken about so-called extreme vetting. Can we really? The problem is that the average age of the individual when he, and they're all males, carry out the attack or are arrested for plotting to carry out an attack, it's about 28, 29. The average age of arrival in the United States of those same individuals is about 14 years old.
Right, so they're minors.
So they're kids. And, you can vet people to see if they're pretending to be something they're not, that is, concealing their real identity. But I don't know what kind of vetting we can do that looks into the face of a kid, a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old, and predicts what that person is going to be 15 years down the road. What will they believe? What will they do?
Also, you do have almost an issue of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't want to give the impression to, let's say, immigrants coming into the U.S. that they are expected to become a terrorist.
No, I mean, the other thing, there's very good news on this, because they're going to say, well, is our system of screening people, of vetting people, of authorizing visas to travel, is it broken, and do we have huge vulnerabilities? The United States is a big country, and a lot of people go there. So since 9/11, on average, we have been admitting about 75,000 to 100,000 refugees every year. About 1 million immigrants, non-refugee immigrants, every year. About 10 million people come into the country on non-immigrant visas, student visas, business visas, things of that sort. And there are about another 22 million entries under visa waiver program. These are
like an ESTA.
Yeah. And so we have millions, actually 30 to 40 million entries every year in the United States. Of these, if you take 178 people over a 16-year period, we're talking about an average of 11 persons a year out of
30 to 40
a haystack
million.
of tens of millions. And so it says, look, our systems are not broken. We're not. These are not infiltrators pouring through the borders. Moreover, they're not infiltrators.
These are the exceptions.
And even of those 91 who came in from abroad, only a dozen or so have come in since 9/11.
Okay.
So now we're talking about less than one a person, so one a year. So the systems are working. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, U.S. citizens born here in the United States or born in the United States, kids coming in who become jihadists 15 years later, they are radicalizing here. I suppose we could be perversely proud of that. I mean, American jihadists are made in the USA. We're not importing them. So it is that finding. And then we take a closer look at those who are radicalizing. And first conclusion is a positive one. The number is really small. We have 320 million people in the United States. We have a Muslim population of about 3.3 million. And again, we're talking about 11 people a year. It is apparent that the jihadist ideology is not gaining a lot of traction in the community. And when we look at the biographies of the individuals, it is even more interesting. Increasingly, first of all, they're getting younger. Second, about 40% of them are converts. Third, we're seeing more and more individuals who have histories of aggression, of substance abuse,
So the factors
of addiction,
are not necessarily just from Islamic influence.
That's the point. In other words, I don't want to assert that the belief system has nothing to do with it, but there are very idiosyncratic factors. These are troubled young men, and that makes it even more difficult to deal with. We don't have an X-ray for a man's soul, so.
Well, is with increasing, not quite violations of privacy, but when privacy gets kind of the more the monitoring goes, the more you can perhaps look at trends and prevention becomes that much easier. But of course, that begs the question into the legitimacy of invasions on privacy as a basic right.
This is a constant source of tension. In the very first little book that I wrote about terrorism in 1974, sometimes you just get lucky and get inspired to write a paragraph that then holds up over the years. And I wrote the observation that because of modern technologies, vulnerabilities in modern society, invention of terrorist tactics, that power defined crudely as simply the capacity to kill, destroy, disrupt, create alarm, oblige societies to divert vast resources to security, that power was descending from armies into the hands of gangs. Even individuals whose grievance is real or imaginary, it wasn't always going to be possible to satisfy. And how we, as a democratic society, were going to deal with that and remain a democratic society was one of the major challenges we face, and I think still face today.
Even more so today, I think.
Even more so because, technology has created advances that enable us to collect, store, mechanically analyze vast amounts of data, capacities we did not have before. And so there is an understanding tendency to want to mobilize that to prevent attacks. And this is a fundamental change that has taken place over the years. Traditionally, in dealing with crime, law enforcement, a crime was committed. A law enforcement would attempt to identify the perpetrator and apprehend that individual, bring them to justice, and the court would deal with it. as terrorism escalated, and especially in a post 9/11 environment, finding people after an attack, assuming they had survived the attack and were not suicide attackers, was really not satisfactory if scores of people or hundreds of people or even thousands of people were dead.
Correct.
And so there was great pressure on the authorities to move upstream toward prevention. The law was changed, and in fact the law allows prosecution in the United States, criminal prosecution, on the basis of intentions. In other words, what it has to be demonstrated in the court is not that you committed
The crime.
a violent act, but it is a crime to have demonstrably intended. Now that has great consequences.
For sure.
And it creates a great deal of tension in our society as to what we will permit. At the same time, and this is in the United States, I can't say to what extent this exists in Israel, but there's a corresponding societal trend which is an effort to abolish all risk. Not just risk from terrorism, but simply to remove risk from society.
How can that be done?
It can't. It cannot be done. It's not realistic.
Yeah, it sounds impossible.
Moreover, to the extent that it can be done, the United States government is obliged, in accord with the Constitution, to provide for the common defense. That's the language of the Constitution, provide for the common defense. But providing for the common defense cannot be translated into guaranteeing every single individual against all risks.
Of course.
There are risks in society. And so we have to make decisions about the level of risk that we think is tolerable, and what measures we will impose, and what that means in terms of our basic liberties.
These are all big, big questions that policymakers and academics, to be honest, it's questions that need to be asked by everyone. I wanted to ask you about a book that you wrote 8 years ago regarding the possibility of terrorist organizations going nuclear. Traditionally, we think of, terrorists doing things like bombs, large-scale things like 9/11, but we don't really, apart from in the movies, you don't really think of nuclear or biochemical attacks from terrorist organizations. What did you find?
Well, we looked at it, and here again, there is good news. Of all of the terrorist organizations in the world that have existed over, let's say, the past half century and so on, we only have a couple that even contemplated acquiring nuclear weapons. One was Aum Shinrikyo, the cult in Tokyo that was responsible for the attack on Tokyo's subways in 1995, which involved nerve gas, sarin. They had a fairly ambitious research program looking at biological weapons, chemical weapons, and it appears that in the course of that, the idea of nuclear weapons crossed their mind. There's some notes indicating that, but not much in the way of serious efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Al-Qaeda in the 1990s became fascinated with nuclear weapons, at least Osama bin Laden did, and they actually made attempts to acquire fissile material.
Wow.
And nuclear weapons. Now they didn't do so. They were the victims themselves of scams, and they had no capacity. They had no material, no capacity to make a nuclear weapon. Interestingly, though, they knew that, and they decided to continue discussing and making claims that they were
Perhaps just to stir the pot.
Well, one, to create alarm among their foes, and second, to create excitement among their followers.
Wow.
And so this points to one of the real conclusions, and that is the terrorists were really, they didn't have the skills of physicists to make a bomb, but they were very skillful at manipulating alarm, and that's what terrorists do. That's what terrorism is.
Exactly, that's their goal. They don't need, I mean, if they've succeeded in getting people scared of a potential nuclear attack, that's half of their ambition in the first place.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, we would see, for example, low-level attacks by other terrorist organizations in the vicinity of a nuclear reactor. Now, the nuclear reactor wasn't the target. It was never in danger, but by doing so, they could ensure that the first paragraph of the news broadcast would have the word nuclear and terrorism in it, which was good enough to create a kind of a fission of fear, if you will. So this was as much about motives as about capabilities and how they dealt and how they dealt with this. What made this more urgent as a topic of inquiry, of course, was 9/11. 9/11 had, in addition to, of course, the physical effects it had and the psychological scarring that it caused, it had an insidious effect on the analysis of terrorism itself. And that is terrorist scenarios that the day before 9/11 would have been dismissed as the stuff of suspense novels and Hollywood screenwriters, the day after 9/11 became operative presumptions. In other words, 9/11 fundamentally altered our perceptions of plausibility. Moreover, if we looked at terrorism historically, in the worst incidents of terrorism in the 1970s, in terms of fatalities, were measured in the tens. In the 1980s, this escalated to the hundreds dead in a single episode. In the 90s, this became increasingly common. On 9/11, we ascended into the thousands. And so here we had over a 30-year period, 2 orders of magnitude increase from tens to hundreds to thousands. And it led to the extrapolation that in another 10 years, we're going to be looking at incidents with fatalities 10,000, perhaps even 100,000. The only way that can be achieved is through the use of weapons of mass destruction.
Correct.
And therefore, nuclear terrorism became a topic of increasing interest and concern.
And do you think now, looking at it, is it a real risk that terrorist organizations will have capabilities of mass destruction?
I don't. Look. I'm not nationally recognized in the field of prophecy, so
we won't hold you to your word.
No, this is not something that you can make a probabilistic statement about. And in fact, in the course of writing the book, I conducted a poll of what I would describe as an expert audience. These were people at the nuclear laboratories in the United States and their counterparts in Europe and elsewhere, people who actually designed and fabricated nuclear weapons, and who thought about this in the intelligence community. And the question was a simple one. What is the probability that terrorists somewhere in the world will detonate a nuclear device in the next 10 years? The answers ranged from probability of 1, in other words, virtual certainty, to 1 in 10 million. And there was no distribution curve. I mean, it was flat right across.
Okay, so
if there was a consensus, a median point, it was around 10%.
Okay.
It has no predictive value whatsoever. I think the only thing it illustrated is that even those who know how to do this, who spend their lives studying this, do not agree among themselves about that likelihood.
Okay, so I guess we'll just have to be optimistic that these things will not happen. Another thing that you've written about a lot is about knowing the enemy. It seems that if you look at terrorism, maybe previously the IRA or throughout the 60s and 70s, the enemy was much more defined, whereas today, increasingly in the West, perhaps as a result of political correctness, that people don't know how to address the enemy and don't know we don't know who the enemy is.
Well, I mean, you're right, but there's something else taking place there. First of all, it is very interesting that during the Second World War, our military intelligence, our military commanders, devoted a great deal of attention to understanding our adversaries, the Nazi Germany and the German generals and how they fought. And during, of course, the decades of the Cold War, there was a great deal of intelligence and scholarship devoted to the issue of understanding Soviet behavior, not simply counting the number of Soviet warheads or missiles, but really understanding how they thought about war, how they thought about strategy. I mean, our deterrence strategies depended on understanding
the
enemy. When it came to terrorism, interestingly enough, there was for a long time very little interest in understanding the terrorist. Now, part of it was because of the word understanding itself is slippery. And does understanding mean be understanding of the terrorists? And by inquiring as to how they think and how they decide to do what they do, is that somehow humanizing them?
Or justifying.
Is it somehow justifying them? Exactly right. The second thing was that terrorists were sort of treated as mad dogs. I mean, witches are wicked, dragons breathe fire, terrorists are evil. No further inquiry necessary. You don't try to understand the mindset and strategy of a mad dog. A mad dog is put down. And so I was arguing in that book that we really had to understand how our foes, and in particular our Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and how they saw the world and thought about things. And in fact, I once asked a question. I said, I know what the PowerPoints say in the Pentagon. What does it say on Al-Qaeda's PowerPoints?
These are the questions that need to be asked.
And it's not simply a mirror image of ours, because
sure.
they look at the world completely differently.
And that's also the root of all of their actions.
And that guides their actions. And unless we begin to understand that, then we're not going to be sure how we're doing and what we're doing, if it has any effect on them. But the second development in terms of defining the adversary is taking place right now, and this is troublesome.
Mm-hmm.
As you are correct in pointing out that years ago we were dealing with discrete, defined terrorist organizations, the IRA, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Red Army faction in Germany. These were discrete, identifiable groups. And now, yes, we can talk about ISIS, we can talk about Al-Qaeda, but this is much more a phenomenon, a movement. And when ISIS claims responsibility in Syria for some individual that it carries out some act of violence, possibly in response to exhortation, online exhortation, there's not necessarily any direct linkage, and that individual has not been brought into an organization. It hasn't been recruited and vetted and assigned something. It is rather action first, then membership comes posthumously.
Right, exactly. And of course, ISIS gladly will take credit for anything that they can.
Yes,
it works in their favor too.
And therefore, this leads to this apprehension that none of us are safe anywhere, that our neighbor, that the man who drives the taxi, that the individual, working at the supermarket could actually underneath be, a terrorist in disguise. And so then the enemy becomes less an organized group, an enterprise, and it becomes not just the ideology, because then people say, well, the enemy is not the individual terrorist, it is radical Islamic extremism. Okay, some people go even further, and in my view, it's completely counterproductive, and say the enemy is Islam itself. This is an inherently aggressive ideology.
Yeah, you make your job that much harder when your enemy is
well,
that much bigger.
If you're declaring a religious war, I mean, that has operational consequences.
For sure.
It has consequences for our society, and as I say, I think that we have to be very, very careful in that we not portray this as a religious war. Our adversaries, by the way, would love for that to happen. That would play into their hands, and it would be entirely counterproductive. But because we've moved from discrete groups to a foggier phenomenon, that has made it more difficult
to define the enemy,
to actually get the parameters around what we consider the enemy.
Okay. Well, this has been super interesting. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you for coming and being such a great friend to the ICT and the IDC in general. It's really, as a student here, it's a pleasure to know that we have such a good cooperation overseas. And really, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an honor and privilege for me.